On today's episode of Locked on Wild, one final look at the numbers for 2023-2024.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Game off. We got to talk more about Monopoly Go. This fast-paced game lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis to taunt your friends. So download Monopoly Go, now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we'll take a final look at the statistics on a team-wide basis for the Wild in 2023-2024 and where they rank amongst the rest of the NHL. We'll take a look at how they compare to the playoff fields, and we will take a look at the areas that need the most work going into the next season. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and I do just want to follow up on yesterday's episode with one piece of one nugget from Michael Russo in regards to the Wild being in the same situation as the Minnesota Twins. Comcast and Xfinity no longer carrying Bally Sports, at least until negotiations have led to an agreement. Russo asked by Ron, one of our listeners, if the Wild are faced with the same problem that the Twins are with Bally Sports for next season. And Russo responds, yes, the Wild, like all teams affected, are working on alternative broadcasting solutions for next season, over-the-air/streaming. Here's the key piece. If there's not a solution at the next bankruptcy court date in 2 weeks, Russo said, I'd be surprised if they're on Bally's next year, even with 1 year left on the rights deal. So 2 weeks from now, we'll probably circle back to this to see what we found out and what it means going forward. So just wanted to pass that along, but let's take a look at the statistics for the Minnesota Wild. We'll start on offense, and we'll move into some other metrics as well, defense and goaltending, and then special teams. So for the offense, Minnesota Wild finished 21st in the league with 248 goals scored. That did equate out to 3.02 goals per game for those that like to see a number above 3. But 21st in the league, not great, because let's look at how the rankings are on the other end. Colorado Avalanche led the league with 302 goals. They made the playoffs. In fact, they advanced to round 2. Toronto Maple Leafs are on the brink of being eliminated in their series against Boston, but they still made the playoffs with 298 goals. Dallas Stars, 294 goals. They made the playoffs. Edmonton Oilers, 292 goals. They made the playoffs. Tampa Bay Lightning, Vancouver Canucks, New York Rangers, Carolina Hurricanes. You have to go down to number 9 in the league, Detroit Red Wings, to find the first team that didn't make the postseason. And guess what? They were in it up until the final day of the season. And so it could have been, with a couple more bounces going their way, it could have been that they made it. Then Nashville, number 10, they had 266 goals. They made the playoffs. Florida also made the playoffs with 265 at number 11. The New Jersey Devils also did not make the playoffs. They had 264 goals. Basically, the top 15 teams in the league, only 2 of them did not make the postseason. All of them had, top 15 offenses in the league. The only teams that are outliers, extreme outliers, is the Washington Capitals, who scored 216 goals this season and still made the postseason. They were 28th in the league in goals scored. So there's one outlier beyond that, beyond the Los Angeles Kings at 17. Every other team and the New York Islanders at 22, they had 245 goals. But for the most part, if you were in the top 15 in the league in goals scored, you were a playoff team this year. There were a couple of exceptions, but you look at Detroit and New Jersey, goaltending really let them down. Had they gotten better goaltending, they're probably in for sure. But the point that I'm trying to make is, of the bottom 17 teams in the league in terms of goal scoring, only 3 of those teams made the postseason. It's a goal scoring league. It is a league that prides itself on flashy offense, tons of skill, and speed up and down the lineup. And you see that in those top 15 teams, and especially in that top 10. There's a ton of speed, a ton of skill, a ton of attack. And those teams really lit it up here this season. Now, let's dive a little further. And we have talked at length all season about some of the things that were issues for this Minnesota Wild team. I just want to try to paint a picture here as to what we saw unfold throughout the course of the season. You take the 248 goals scored by the Minnesota Wild. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to count the calculator down. I got the calculator app up on my computer based off of the top goal scorers for the Minnesota Wild. So we start right off the bat. Kirill Kaprizov had 46. So we're going to deduct 46 from the Wild's total. That gets them to 202. Next, we'll go to Matt Boldy, who scored 29 goals. That drops you down to 173. After that, Joel Eriksson Ek, he scored 30. So that drops you down to 143. And then let's take Ryan Hartman and Marco Rossi out too. Well, even if you just take those top 3, you have 143 goals for the rest of your roster. And there were 24 players that scored goals for the Minnesota Wild this season. And so 143 goals divided by 21 players is not great. That is an average of 6 goals per player for the entire rest of your roster. Now, if you go even further out and you take the 143, you subtract Marco Rossi's 21 goals, and you subtract Ryan Hartman's 21 goals, that leaves you 101 goals for the 24 players, the 19 remaining players on your roster. So let's see what that averages out to. 101 divided by 19. That averages out to 5.3 goals per player after your top 5. That's not ideal in the slightest. And that is something that we've talked about it. It's going to need major work going into next season and beyond. Now, the hope is that the wave of prospects that is going to gradually make their way onto the roster, we've seen it with the likes of Marat Huznadinov, Liam Ugrin, who it is expected will make the team next year. After that, there could be other guys that do. But if you want my honest opinion, the roster's pretty well locked in, as evident by Danil Yurov deciding that he's going to take another season at the KHL. And look, go make your bag, honestly. Like, he's making 4 times what he made last year. Go make your bag. this roster is going to need to, like, you're going to need to break some of the ice. Go take a mallet to the top of the ice and break it up. It's like when you get to the end of the spring, the end of the winter, end of ice fishing season, and the ice starts to break up in the water. Need to do some of that to try to shift some of these parts around. That number has to improve, because let's take Colorado, for instance. Let's do the same thing that we just did for the Minnesota Wild for the Colorado Avalanche and see what we get for a similar total there. The Avalanche scored 302 goals this season. Let's see where we get after their top 5 players. So let's subtract Nathan MacKinnon's 51, gets you to 251. Mikko Rantanen, subtract his 42. Subtract Valeri Nichushkin's 28. Subtract Cale Makar's 21. And then subtract Jonathan Drouin's 19. And you get 141 for the... There were 31 players that scored a goal for the Colorado Avalanche, but you have 40 more goals from your non-top 5 if you're the Avs than you are the Wild. That makes a difference. And so it can't be, I've said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. It can't just be the top 5 guys. It can't just be the top 3 guys. You have to find other ways to get goals in this league. Look at every postseason series that has gone on so far this year. Guys that are not the top options for their team are stepping up and making plays. The top guys are playing well, by and large, but other guys that are not the top guys on the roster are making plays themselves. So you have to find a way to get the other 19 players or 20 players or however many players score. And honestly, even if you just go by the standard 12 players, 4 lines, if 5 of those guys are doing a majority of the scoring, that means that 7 others are not. So that's got to improve. That has to improve. It's got to be a clear focus, and it's not something you're going to be able to do overnight, which in tomorrow's show will be interesting, because what we're going to do is we are going to, you remember, for those that are not NBA fans, the NBA has an amnesty clause to where teams can take a contract off of their books. They can do this one. Well, we're going to do it 3 times for tomorrow's show. And we're going to try to fill based off of what was available at the time that those deals were signed. So that could be a way to fill some of the lack of secondary scoring that plagued the Wild throughout the course of the year. But honestly, if you watch this team, it shouldn't be a surprise that the offense struggled outside of the main 3 guys, because by and large, it's a roster that does not feature nearly as much skill and speed as it should. Hopefully that will change in the coming years, but there's some work to do to make that happen. We'll take a look at the defense and goaltending coming up next. But first, let's get a word from our sponsors coming up here on Locked on Wild. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Monopoly Go. All right, game off. We got to talk more about Monopoly Go. So we're going to take a little pause here. I know what you're saying. Throw the flag. You've already talked about Monopoly Go to start the episode, but there's just so much good stuff going on with this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. Just finished a challenge in which you build parade floats with your friends and ended up getting a couple of huge bonuses. I think one of them was 1,000 rolls, which goes a long way. And so that's just a sampling of what is offered at Monopoly Go. You can win unique stickers you can trade with your friends to complete albums for big prizes. plus hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton of them include their own unique mini games, like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. There's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench. Go download it now, free on the Google Play or App Store. Game on. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. You can check out Locked On Sports today, 24/7 streaming of your favorite sports and teams without all the screaming. Head to the Locked On Sports Today channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day. As mentioned for tomorrow's episode, we are going to amnesty 3 contracts off of the Minnesota Wild roster and see what we could fill those contracts with or could have at the time they were signed. So keep an eye out for that. Coming up on tomorrow's show should be a good one for you to finish off your week. So let's look at defense for the Minnesota Wilds. Now, goals allowed per game. There is some goaltending that factors into this as well. The Minnesota Wilds allowed 260 goals, which was 20th in the league. Let's flip that around. The fewest goals allowed in the league were the Florida Panthers at 198. They were tied with the Winnipeg Jets. Minnesota Wilds down to 20th. They allowed 260 as mentioned. And again, this should not be a surprise either, because whether it be the combination of defense or goaltending, there was just a lot in the way of struggle by the Minnesota Wild's goalies throughout basically the entirety of the season. And it led to many games in which the Wilds found themselves trailing before you could even blink. And many times in which the offense just was not able to try to mount a comeback throughout a large majority of the season. You look at the save percentage for the Wild this season. They were near the bottom of the list. The Ottawa Senators actually were dead last with an .888 save percentage. Minnesota Wilds collectively as a team had an .897. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, seventh worst in the NHL, tied with the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, if you look at it as well, from a shutouts perspective, the Wild actually had 6 shutouts on the season, which put them in the top third of the league. But let's take a look at save percentage here to illustrate my previous point. And we'll just sift through and see how many of these teams made the postseason. Winnipeg Jets, yes, they got their faces caved in the series because Connor Hellebuck couldn't make a save. But number 1 save percentage team in the league, they made the postseason. Florida Panthers were number 2. They made the postseason with a .918 save percentage. Boston Bruins were 3rd. They had a .915 save percentage in the regular season. They made the postseason. St. Louis Blues did not. They were 4th, which is interesting, but they did not make the postseason. Los Angeles Kings were 5th. They did. New York Rangers were 6th. They did. New York Islanders were 7th. They did. Vancouver did. They were 8th. The Seattle Kraken did not. Nashville Predators were 10th. They did. Vegas 11th. They made it. Carolina 12th. They made the postseason. Edmonton at 13th, Dallas at 14th, both made the postseason as well. And the Buffalo Sabres at 15, they did not. So basically, of the top 15, 1, 2, 3 of the top 15 teams did not make the postseason. 12 of the 16 playoff teams were in the top 15 in the league. The outliers, Washington, they were 17th in the league in save percentage at .903. Colorado collectively, they were 20th in the league with a .902. Now, again, these are percentage points, so you make a 2 percentage point jump, you're in the top 10 if you're the Colorado Avalanche. But the Toronto Maple Leafs had an .898 save percentage as a team. They were 23rd. And the Tampa Bay Lightning, now this is because Andrei Vasilevsky was out for a good majority of the season. They were 28th in the league in save percentage at .896. But as we'll talk about, they had just outrageously good special teams. You have to have at least a couple of these elements in your favor in order to be like a good playoff team. And not only did the Wild not have a good offense, they did not have good goaltending this year. And it's interesting too, because if we take a look at like piece by piece of the regular season, there really weren't a ton of instances in which the goalie numbers were particularly like jump off the page at you. We'll start at the beginning of the season. We'll say October 10th to the pre-Dean or the pre-John Hines era. The Minnesota Wilds as a team, now of course I'll illustrate my point here and then we'll move on. The Minnesota Wild in the Dean Evason era as a team, they were allowing 3.17 goals per game in that span. Oh no, come on. Okay. October 10th to November 26th, the Minnesota Wilds were allowing 3.95 goals per game. That's hideously bad. Then if we go from November 27th, we'll go November 27th to the end of the season, or the end of the year, I should say. We'll try to break this up in chunks. So November 27th to December 31st, the Minnesota Wilds allowed 2.25 goals per game. They went 11-5 in that stretch. So things improved, but it did not last. Let's go now from January 1st to let's go to the trade deadline. So January 1st to March 7th, the Wild allowed 3.46 goals per game. So you have this little stretch in which the goaltending was fine, and then it's right back to just not great. And then from March 8th to the end of the season, the Wilds allowed 2.74 goals per game. So just all over the place. Terrible, good, hideous, all right. No consistency. No consistency to what we saw in the net. And as a result, not a surprise. Not a surprise again. You go from the goaltending that this team got 2 years ago to what they got this past season. That's going to lead to some massive drop-off. Speaking of massive drop-off, let's talk about the special teams and see where the Wild rank amongst the rest of the league. We'll take a look at how the Wild special teams stacked up. That's on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild also brought to you by FanDuel. It is winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. There's one game on in the NHL tonight. It's Boston and Toronto. So if you feel like the Bees are going to advance to round 2, there's your $5 bet. And then you have $150 in bonus bets for the weekend. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. One final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wilds. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to tune in tomorrow as we discuss contracts we wish we could just wave away with a wand and make them disappear. Amnesty contracts. 3 different contracts. We'll get rid of them, and we'll look at what the Wild should have done at the time to make some better decisions. Let's talk special teams here to finish things off today. And no surprise here, the Tampa Bay Lightning had the top power play in the NHL at 28.6%. So Tampa Bay made the postseason. Yes, they did lose in the first round, but they still were good enough to get into the playoffs. Carolina, they had the number 2 power play in the NHL at 26.9%. New York Rangers were 3rd. These are all playoff teams. Edmonton, 4th, playoff team. Colorado, 5th, playoff team. Dallas, Toronto, Florida, all playoff teams. You go to Detroit at 9, 23.1%. Not a playoff team. The Minnesota Wild actually finished the season with the 10th best power play in the NHL. 22.7%. They were tied with the Vancouver Canucks in that department. So the one area of the 4 in which the Wild actually were up at the top of the list is the power play. But let's just take stock of what you have at your disposal. Obviously, you've got Kirill Kaprizov. You've got Matt Boldy. You've got Joel Eriksson Ek. You've got a lot of good players on that unit. So, of course, it should be good. And I think we can all, in consensus, say that we feel like the power play should have been better than it was. It feels like there were definitely some power plays left on the table to where maybe if you are able to convert on 5 or 6 more throughout the course of the season, all of a sudden you're knocking on the door of being in like the top 7 in the NHL on the power play. But something that this team still struggles with when they go to the man advantage is just the notion of just shooting the puck. Trying to keep an eye out for perfect opportunities often leads to those opportunities never materializing, which leads to a lot of just passing back and forth, passing up the ice, trying to zip a pass across the other side of the net that gets knocked away by the opponent or cleared down to the other end. But that one thing is the spot in which the Wilds would have been able to carry their weight. That was the one part of the season that did not go terribly wrong. But you can't even give special teams full credit here because the penalty kill is just so far from ever being good. Let's just look at how the rest of the top 15. So you've got 2 teams right now in the top 10 that are not playoff teams. Vancouver at 11 is. Los Angeles is. New Jersey is not at 13. Boston at 14 is. Then you have Arizona at 15, not a playoff team. So 1, 2, 3, 4 of the top 15 in power play percentage did not make the postseason. And let's look at the biggest outlier from the playoffs as far as special team success goes. Winnipeg Jets were down at 22, 18.8%. They were the only sub 20% power play to make the postseason this year. Vegas was at 20.2%. They were 20th. New York Islanders at 19th, 20.4. Washington Capitals were at 20.6. They were at 18. So 5 of the bottom 17 made the postseason, but the worst there was Winnipeg at 22. So you have to have a good power play. And the Wilds have the makings of one, but there is still work to be done there. Penalty kill, I don't know that I even want to really dwell on it. I don't think anybody wants to relive what we saw in the penalty kill all season. It was goalies not making saves. It was, frankly, too many penalties all season long. And it led to the Wild having the 30th ranked penalty kill this season. 3-0. 30th ranked at 74.5%. As far as the playoffs go, Carolina had the best penalty kill in the league at 86.4. I would even take 80% at this point. I'd even be fine with 80, just not 74.5. Hurricanes made the postseason. Kings, Rangers, Philadelphia Flyers were number 4 in the league with an 83.4% penalty kill. They did not make the postseason of their struggles elsewhere, namely scoring. Tampa Bay Lightning were in the top 5 in both units, power play and penalty kill. Can we please just be top 5 in one? Florida at 6, Boston at 7, Dallas at 8, Calgary at 9, and you have a mini run here of 3 different teams that did not make the postseason that were in the top 15. Calgary, Pittsburgh, New Jersey, then Colorado at 12, Buffalo 13, Detroit 14, and Edmonton at 15. Your bottom half, Vegas at 16, 79.3, Vancouver at 17, Washington at 19, Winnipeg at 21. So I guess we shouldn't have been surprised at all by the Winnipeg Jets getting beaten round 1 because their special teams were not great. Nashville at 22, Toronto at 23. So some outliers. Oh, and stop the presses. Worst penalty kill in the league made the postseason. But if I recall correctly, they got absolutely destroyed by the Carolina Hurricanes on special teams. Not surprised. The New York Islanders were 32nd in the league, 71.5. Gross. And they still made the postseason. But again, they were able to, I don't know. They were able to grab one of the final spots in a soft underbelly of the Eastern Conference. But they are a team that is old and slow. They've got good goaltending. So basically the moral of the story here is that if you can be a team that is in at least the top 15 in pretty much every statistical category, offense, goaltending, special teams, if you're in the top 15 in those areas, you stand a chance to be playoff caliber. If you are in the top 10 in those categories, you move into contender status. And basically the fact that the Wild were 20th, 23rd, and then 30th in penalty kill. My overall point, the Wild have work to do. Now, we are going to shift into evaluation mode starting Monday. We'll start with our player evaluations, and we'll have polls on YouTube. We'll have polls on social media as well, so you can vote as to who you think or what letter grade you think each player should get. So we'll probably put the first one out tomorrow, give you an opportunity over the weekend to think it over, and then we start our player evals on Monday. Thanks for tuning into today's episode of Locked On Wild. Always appreciate the listeners interacting and following the show. Makes getting through long, stressful weeks very much tolerable on my end. So appreciate everybody's support and appreciate the community that Locked On Wild has become. Make sure to join us for tomorrow's new episode of Locked On Wild. And you can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.